All right, welcome to the Explainer. Sometimes what looks like a simple government project, say building a new road in New Taipei City, can get really complicated fast. To build this road, the city needed to buy some private land. But for one of the landowners, a charitable foundation, the whole deal just went sideways. What should have been a straightforward transaction completely spiraled into a massive legal battle that went all the way to Taiwan's Supreme Court.
Okay, so the whole conflict really boils down to these two numbers you see here. After some initial talks, the landowner, the Taipei Zhenqi Relief Institution, was expecting a price somewhere around NT dollars 17,300 per square meter. But then the final official offer from the government came in, and it was quite a bit lower, just NT dollars 16,200. Now that gap, NT dollars 1,100 per square meter, might not sound like a fortune, but when you're talking about a whole plot of land, it added up to a difference of over 2 million new Taiwan dollars.
So how in the world could the two valuations be so different? I mean, the government used professional appraisers, but the landowner was absolutely convinced that the price was unfair. This was never just a simple disagreement over money. And the fight to close this price gap, well, it would end up setting a huge legal precedent. So first, let's unpack how the government even got its number.
Right, so how did the government come up with its number? It wasn't just pulled out of thin air. There's actually a standard technique appraisers use called the comparative valuation method. And in theory, it's designed to be this objective, evidence-based process.
Okay, so it basically works like this, in 3 steps. First, the appraiser goes out and finds recent sales of similar properties in the area. We'll call them comparables. Then, and this is key, they adjust the prices of those sales to account for any differences. Things like a better location or maybe the land is a weird shape. Finally, they crunch the numbers and calculate a weighted average of these adjusted prices to set the final value. It sounds perfectly scientific, right?
Now, even though the government looked at 3 different properties to compare, the entire dispute very quickly zeroed in on just one of them. In all the court documents, it's just called comparable property number 2. And this one property, well, it became the absolute center of the whole thing. The government's final price was almost entirely riding on how they valued this single piece of land.
And this is where the plot really thickens. Because according to the official sales records, comparable property number 2 sold for almost NT dollars 22,000 per square meter. That's a high price. It's actually much closer to what the landowner was expecting. So you're probably thinking, if this was their main comparison, how on earth did they end up with a final offer that was so much lower?
Well, here's what they did. The appraiser took that nearly NT $22,000 figure and adjusted it way down to this, just over NT $15,000. That is a massive reduction. We're talking almost 30%. The big question is, what could possibly justify a cut that huge? That question, right there, is the heart of this entire case.
So the landowner, convinced this valuation was just plain wrong, decided to challenge the new Taipei city government. They filed a lawsuit. They argued that the whole appraisal process was flawed and that the compensation they were offered was totally unfair. Their case went to the Taipei High Administrative Court.
But they hit a brick wall. The High Court just dismissed the lawsuit. Its ruling basically said, look, property valuation is a highly professional field. We have to defer to the professional judgment of the city's appraisers and their land value committee. So for the landowner, it really looked like this was the end of the road.
But they didn't stop there. They appealed, taking their case all the way to the highest court in Taiwan. And this time, the court did something different. Instead of just taking the experts' word for it, the Supreme Court decided to really dig into the facts themselves. It focused like a laser on the single most critical piece of this puzzle, that huge price adjustment on comparable property number 2.
And the Supreme Court managed to boil this whole complicated case down to one single, really simple question. The total sale price for comparable property #2 was 1.8 million new Taiwan dollars. The question was, what did that price tag actually cover? The official record only said land, but sitting right on that land was an unlisted metal building that was being used for parking. So did the sale price include the building or not? The answer would decide everything. You see, the government appraiser's whole argument, it all hung on this one belief. They argued that the NT dollars $1.8 million sale price had to have included the value of that metal building. It just had to. So they just estimated the building's value at about NT dollars $600,000 and then simply subtracted that from the total sale price. And that's how they got their final value for just the land. But here's the kicker, the fatal flaw that the Supreme Court uncovered. When the court asked for proof, the government had nothing. The appraiser had assumed the building was part of the sale, pretty much just because the price seemed too high for land alone. But the actual hard evidence, the official deed of sale, it only listed land. The entire multi-million-dollar calculation wasn't based on fact, it was based on a hunch.
In its final ruling, the Supreme Court used this really powerful phrase to describe what the appraiser did. Uksaktitu. It basically translates to conjecture and guesswork. The court's message couldn't have been clearer. You cannot base an official government valuation, one that directly affects a citizen's constitutional right to their property, on an unproven assumption. And the High Court's failure to catch that was a major error.
So, the Supreme Court overturned the High Court's decision. It sent the case back to be decided all over again, but this time using a proper, evidence-based valuation. The landowner finally won their appeal. But the impact of this ruling goes so much further than this one road in Tamsui. It really set a new standard for how we can challenge expert decisions.
So this case really drilled down on a key legal idea called judgment discretion. Think of it as the wiggle room that courts normally give to government experts. But what the Supreme Court's ruling made crystal clear is that this discretion isn't a blank check. If an expert's judgment is based on wrong facts or incomplete information, or, like in this case, pure guesswork, then that judgment can and should be thrown out.
So what are the big takeaways from all this? What does it mean for us? First, expert opinions have to be backed up by actual evidence. Second, that professional judgment isn't some magic shield. You can question it, and it has to be defended with facts. Third, the burden of proof is on the one making the big claim. It was the government's job to prove the building was part of the sale, not the landowner's job to prove it wasn't. And finally, and maybe most importantly, a single factual mistake can bring a whole complex decision crashing down.
So, in the end, this story that started with just a tiny strip of land for a road, it leaves us all with a much bigger question. It's a question about finding the right balance between expertise and accountability. It really makes you think, in all parts of our lives, when should we just trust an expert, and when should we be brave enough to ask to see the proof?